This is the first time I've ever seen a budget where the finance minister has actually espoused the use of the term digital as often as she has. I've actually counted no less than 35 times she's actually used that particular phrase, and in conjunction with terms such as startups, high tech, and technology, that number actually we're closer to 70 or 75%. This budget actually sets the tone for what I'm actually calling the decade of digital. What's actually happening right now since the pandemic? Digital is no longer a curiosity, it's actually an inevitability in everyone's lives. And for any company, organization, or country, for that particular matter, that actually fails to adapt, they will actually be left behind in this very fast-paced world. And what this government has also done, the scope of this budget is the government's actually acknowledged this and has actually brought some level of clarity into one of the most important, I would say, figureheads of the entire digital revolution, which is actually cryptocurrency. Now, all of us know for a long period of time that cryptocurrencies actually existed, and Indians have actually been amongst the third largest investors in this particular asset class itself. But unfortunately, in 2018, as all of us know, the government looked to actually ban cryptocurrency, and as all of us on this call are painfully aware of, any ban on what is basic human activity never actually translates to activity actually stopping. It just sends it underground, and by virtue of sending it underground, the country and the economy is actually deprived of what it actually entails. By actually bringing up a taxation framework, the government has actually acknowledged the existence of this particular asset class, number one. Number two, created a framework and certainty for the taxation of the same. I mean, we can debate about whether the fact that the rules that come out are actually just or not, but the fact they've actually created a framework will actually allay a large amount of suspicion. And number three, by the announcement of the digital rupee, the ability for Web3 companies to actually start developing their applications from India will actually continue. We've actually lost, by my count, close to 3 generations of entrepreneurs over the past since the ban of crypto, who've actually moved to the US, who've actually moved to Singapore to actually start creating these sort of applications in itself. And India is thankfully taking a pace from the playbook of everyone else, where they said, let's not actually ban it, let's actually tax it. Let's actually learn from it, and let's actually adopt it, ingest it, and actually continue the entire thing forward. So that's one aspect that needs to be noted. The second part that I think is extremely imperative is the fact that they finally acknowledged the distortions in our tax code between listed securities and unlisted securities. All of us remember the 2019 budget, when they actually announced the super risk surcharge. We saw the stock market hemorrhage 14 lakh crores in the span of 14 days. The moment that hemorrhaging happened, they've actually gone and reversed that, saying that the super risk surcharge will no longer actually apply to them, whereas it only applies to the unlisted security space itself. Because of that, unlisted securities faced a maximum long-term capital gains rate of 28.5%, as opposed to 10.91% that the listed counterparts actually ended up enjoying. And that distortion actually happens across 3 levels. One is in terms of the basic tax rate, where unlisted securities are taxed at twice the rate. 2 was in the level of surcharge, where the level of surcharge was capped at 15% for listed securities, but went as high as 37% for the unlisted space as part of that. And the thirdly was in terms of the period of holding. Now, they've taken a great step forward in terms of ensuring parity. And this has been a long-standing ask, not just of the VC industry, but of startups and entrepreneurs themselves. All entrepreneurs, when they start off their business, invest the largest, all their capital into the business itself and actually take very little out in terms of their salary. A large amount of their remunerations actually bookended, and the company either exits through an IPO or through an M&A transaction itself. At that point in time, for them to actually pay such a high tax rate was actually pushing a large number of founders to actually move overseas to either Singapore or the US. We've actually seen that the inroads to the Indian startup ecosystem was no longer through Bangalore. It was actually through Singapore. A large just in the year ending 2019, when India had about 42 unicorns, more than half of them were actually domiciled overseas. As part of it, India was losing. The Indian government seemed to be more happy in terms of taking the 10% tax rate or the 14% tax rate, as opposed to taking the entire pie itself. So that parity that actually ends up coming now is actually going to be huge. And the third part, that putting on my investor hat as of now, is the fact that the government's actually acknowledged that the private equity and the venture capital industry is unique, and they actually needs to have a dialogue in terms of the approach of making regulations. All of us have far too often actually faced the brunt of someone sitting in Delhi actually creating laws that actually start affecting the entire private equity industry itself. Even very recently, the fact that they actually wanted to pierce the corporate veil when it came to Mauritius funds, go all the way down to the UBO and find out how the decision-making aspect actually comes in, actually become extremely pernicious. Section 9A which actually speaks of the place of effective management and application to fund managers, still has only about 4 or 5 funds that have actually taken up that particular approach. Even though the announcement of this committee is not as exciting as a reduction in the tax rate, the dialogue that the government actually wants to engender as of now is actually a step forward in the right direction. When I had the privilege of actually being part of the roundtable with the Prime Minister of the country, Narendra Modi, one of the aspects that we actually brought up over there was the fact that, look, the AF industry in India is actually large. We have actually grown at a CAGR of 108% from December 31st, 2012 to September 30th, 2021. That's extremely large. The only thing to grow faster than that has actually been the valuation of some of India's unicorns. And the AF industry has actually supported that. And unfortunately, the investing industry in the country has actually suffered from having archaic laws actually forced onto them. As an AIF, I can actually create my entity in 3 ways. One as a trust, a private company, or an LLP. Now, unfortunately, all 3 of them actually have negative case laws and precedents that are unfortunately getting attached to AIFs as of now. And that actually creates uncertainty. And even though capital at the end of the day, Sudhir, as you know, is actually extremely cowardly. It can actually take execution risk. It cannot afford to take regulatory risk. And that's actually pushing a large number of funds to actually move overseas. So I think what the government has done right now is acknowledge the digital revolution that's happening, set up a framework for a dialogue to get created, and is actually trying to mainstream and integrate a large amount of this into the regulatory framework. I think that is a sign in the right direction, and this will augur very well for the coming decade to come.
Fantastic. Yes, Siddharth, very succinctly explained, and I can see the passion coming through as well, as it should. Just a couple of follow-up points, Siddharth, and you mentioned the meeting with the Prime Minister and the recommendations made by IBCA. So hopefully this committee will be formed, and as you said, there'll be more dialogue. On the parity, you rightly mentioned 3 points, right? So it's only on the surcharge that parity has been acknowledged and implemented. The first one still remains, which is, the discrepancy in the rate itself, which is, I think, the other ask also of the industry, that why would you want to tax unlisted at a higher rate of 20% rather than 10? So that is, I think, one aspect. And I would just like to touch upon the aspect of, quote unquote, migration of startups or other entrepreneurs, etc. Now, we can debate a lot about, what all needs to be done, and, developing countries will always have some of those challenges. But one thing which stands out is that, as you rightly put it, any government now onwards, at least what is clearly coming out, will need to keep in mind 2 things. One is that a lot of countries are looking at this space in a very intensely competitive manner. Look at UAE. It chose to, amend some of their working days, weeks, to get away from the, sort of the Islamic kind of calendar which they had, or the fact that, personal civil laws will now prevail in the Emirate. Just to give 2 examples, which are nothing to do with tax. But what I'm trying to say is that it's no longer just New York, London, Hong Kong, but more and more centers are coming up, and there is more competition to attract entrepreneurs, innovators, wealthy individuals who will spend more money in that market. That is really the message which is coming. And any government of an emerging market such as India cannot ignore those impulses as well, while striking a balance on moderate tax rates and moderate policy. So coming back, one is on the rate. If you would like to comment in the conversations you had, was the reaction like neutral, or saying, no, the rate cannot be the same because listed have more governance, blah, blah, on that? And the second is on this aspect you touched upon about migration. Anything other than, the regulatory framework should be considered by India to ensure that we retain talent such as yours and so many others inside the country for the future?
So Sudhir, actually to bring up on the very first point itself in terms of parity, what we watch is this has been such a long-standing ask that the industry has actually created, like every single year we actually come out with a new tagline for what that actually entails. This year the tagline was one security, one tax as part of it, like similar to how GST was one nation, one tax. So what we've actually done is when we've actually brought it forward, the government did actually have some extremely legitimate points that they actually brought up. They said, look, when it comes to a listed market, given the fact that the investors are actually SEBI regulated, There's a basic level of KYC that happens. Everything needs to happen. All the transactions are actually recorded. The chances of any evasion actually happening is lower. Whereas in the unlisted space, the latitude that's actually been offered to people, in terms of creating circular transactions and doing all sorts of exotic structuring is actually extremely large. And unless that can actually be plugged, for the sake of the few genuine companies who want to actually avail of the benefits, we cannot actually allow a larger number of unscrupulous players to actually take advantage of that, which is a fair point from their end. And the industry, of course, has actually countered it by saying that, given the fact, at least extended to SEBI-registered AIFs, where we have the same level of diligence, we don't mind dematerializing securities, creating an entire transaction chain and paperwork. We can put it on the blockchain as well. I mean, there are enough companies that can actually do that for that matter to actually make it immutable. But this is something that the government's actually looking at intently, and I do foresee the parity that they've created in terms of the surcharge as the first step in a long-standing series of reforms that will ultimately see the convergence of these two particular tax rates happening itself. I think the government is also painfully aware of how badly the startup industry has actually been hit. But out of $40 billion that Indian startups have actually raised last year, as per a report by EY, close to about only 4 billion of that actually came from Indian sources. A large amount of the money actually comes from foreign sources itself. And this is actually causing our Indian startups to actually flip overseas, which comes to your second point. Where flipping overseas to externalization is when the promoters or the founders are here, but the head office is overseas, and India basically becomes a back office. India should be a land of startups, not a land of subsidiaries. And unfortunately, these are regulations that are actually forcing us to become a land of subsidiaries. And there are government departments. Overseas governments actually have departments dedicated to poaching Indian startups. And for the first time, as we know, last year, India's software export actually exceeded the total oil export by Saudi Arabia itself, which is large. And if you actually ask me, the only thing that India actually exports more than software is actually software professionals. 1/3 of all the founders in the valley are actually Indian or Indian origin. If you look at any of the unicorns, even the listed unicorns going off an IPO in the US or actually from Singapore, a lot of them are actually Indians. Why is India so intent on actually pushing all these people overseas? It's just a regulation that actually applies. And with India, as we all know, India actually takes a long period of time to actually get comfortable with these regulations to happen. But the finance minister, kudos to her, actually made a strong statement saying they want to move to a trust-based system. It's no longer going to be a licensed Raj or a Babu Raj where you have to sit and actually note everything down. The government is finally willing to actually trust these people, and I do actually foresee that as being positive, because in the digital age that we actually live in right now, the physical boundaries are going to become less relevant than what the digital boundaries are actually going to be. And digital sovereignty is actually going to underscore a large amount of the conflict that's actually going to perpetrate throughout this entire decade itself. It's why I call it the decade of the digital. And the foot soldiers that we actually have are actually going to be the coders. And the protection of the IP that you create, especially when it comes to Web3 or anything else, actually becomes essential over here. And that is a crucial element that India should seek to protect. And this is the first step forward in actually doing that.